Imagine this. You are at a dinner party, surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, and warm company. Yet, in the middle of the noise, a single thought pierces through. Why do I feel lonelier here than when I'm alone? That quiet realization, felt in the chest like a slow tightening, unveils a truth most people spend their lives running from. We have been told again and again that fulfillment comes through partnership, that to be single is to be incomplete. Yet what if the opposite is true? What if staying single is not a deficiency but the most powerful decision a human being can make? This question unsettles because it cuts against the grain of everything we are conditioned to believe. Modern society treats coupledom as the natural state, even the moral state of adulthood. Movies, novels, and family traditions carry the same hidden refrain. You are not whole until you are bound to someone else. And yet, look closer. How many people you know are actually flourishing in their relationships? How many truly thrive, rather than settle? If partnership were such a universal cure, would so many remain disillusioned, restless, and quietly resentful in the supposed embrace of love? Nietzsche, with his ruthless clarity, once remarked, "It is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages." And what he implies here reaches beyond romance. It points to the deeper idea that many unions fail because they are founded on fear of solitude rather than on strength of self. Staying single forces us to confront that solitude directly, to step into the silence most try to drown with companionship. And it is precisely here, in the crucible of aloneness, that the individual discovers who they truly are. Let us not mistake loneliness for solitude. Loneliness is the ache of absence, the restless itch for distraction. Solitude, however, is a furnace of self-creation. It is the difference between wandering in a barren desert and standing before a mountain waiting to be climbed. To embrace singleness is to choose the mountain path, steep and silent, but promising heights most never imagine. The unsettling paradox is this: only by being radically alone do we learn the art of true connection. Carl Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." A single person who learns to articulate their soul to themselves can later speak to others with depth, clarity, and authenticity. Whereas the one who rushes into partnership to escape emptiness brings nothing but shadows into the bond. Staying single is not the rejection of love but the refusal to counterfeit it. It is the bold declaration, "I will not trade my becoming for mere comfort." And this declaration, though frightening, is the seed of freedom. For freedom is not merely the ability to choose, it is the strength to stand alone without collapsing into despair. The first step, then, is to reframe what society calls lack into what philosophy recognizes as potential. The absence of a partner is not a hole but a space, a vast, fertile clearing where the self can grow undisturbed. In this clearing, one learns independence not as isolation but as sovereignty. One learns silence not as emptiness but as music. And above all, one learns that to be single is not to be half, but to be whole, unbroken, and unfinished in the most magnificent sense. From this point forward, the question shifts. It is no longer, "Why am I single?" but rather, "Why do so many fear to be?" And it is that fear, its roots and illusions, that we must unravel next. Why do we fear being single? Why does the image of the solitary man or woman so often evoke pity, or worse, contempt? The answer lies less in love itself and more in the narrative society builds around it. From childhood, we are steeped in myths of soulmates, happy ever afters, and the idea that only through union can life achieve meaning. Those who remain unmarried or childless are spoken of in whispers, as though they embody some tragic failure. Yet beneath this cultural story runs a deeper current, the fear of facing the void of one's own existence without distraction. To understand this, one must grasp that relationships, for many, are not chosen freely but grasped desperately. They function as a shield, a comfort blanket against existential anxiety. Sartre, that uncompromising voice of existentialism, observed, "If you are lonely when you're alone, you are in bad company." Most people cannot bear to sit in their own presence without external validation, without the mirror of another person affirming their worth. Thus, love is pursued not out of abundance but out of poverty, not out of strength but out of avoidance. And yet, when union is born out of fear, the result is not connection but entrapment. Two people clutching at one another in order to escape solitude soon find themselves bound by chains of mutual need, rather than elevated by shared growth. This is why so many relationships decay into resentment. What was meant to be a sanctuary becomes a prison. Each partner unconsciously accuses the other of failing to fill the abyss within, a task that was never theirs to begin with. Consider the social machinery that reinforces this cycle. Advertisements sell products through images of couples. Family members ask not, "How are you growing?" but, "Are you seeing someone?" Holidays become rituals of romantic expectation. To step outside this norm is to invite suspicion. Are you cold, broken, incapable of love? Few realize that this very suspicion arises from envy, the envy of those who cannot bear what the single individual dares to face, themselves. Nietzsche's philosophy offers an antidote. For him, the highest calling of the individual was not to dissolve into another, but to forge the self into a work of art. He praised solitude as the workshop of the Übermensch, the place where raw existence is hammered into creation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he reminds us, the lonely one offers his hand too quickly to whomever he encounters. To resist this reflex, to endure the silence until it becomes strength. This is the heroic path. Schopenhauer, often painted as a pessimist, nonetheless saw clearly the danger of marriage pursued out of fear. He noted that most unions were driven by blind instinct rather than reason, and thus chained individuals to lives of compromise and mediocrity. For him, freedom was rare, and those who managed to remain unbound preserved the possibility of living by their own terms rather than the dictates of biology or convention. Staying single, then, is not a rejection of love. It is a refusal to surrender to the counterfeit forms of it imposed by culture. It is the courage to declare that life's meaning cannot be outsourced, that no partner can do the inner labor of selfhood for you. In a world obsessed with finding the one, the single person instead asks, "What if I become the one?" But to become the one, the individual must dismantle not only society's illusions but also their own inner compulsions. The desperate hunger for validation, the urge to flee silence, the terror of looking into the abyss and finding no answer. And it is to this abyss, the haunting confrontation with meaning itself, that we must now turn. To remain single is to stand before the abyss. It is to resist the easy narrative that someone else will complete you, and instead to ask, what if there is no completion, only becoming? This question unnerves most people because it strips away the consolations of romantic mythology. Without a partner, who are you? Without someone's hand to grasp in the night, what keeps you from falling into despair? The abyss is not an external void. It is the encounter with our own inner nothingness, the realization that meaning is not given but must be created. For those who rush into relationships to avoid this confrontation, the abyss remains buried, gnawing beneath the surface, ready to erupt in discontent. But for the single individual who dares to face it directly, something remarkable happens. The abyss, instead of consuming, begins to transform. Viktor Frankl, a man who endured the death camps of the Holocaust, knew more about the abyss than most human beings. Yet even in those darkest of places, he discovered that meaning can be forged through suffering, choice, and responsibility. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Singleness is precisely this challenge, not to change the external circumstance by finding someone, but to change one's own relationship with solitude. Here is where the single path becomes not a curse but a gift. Alone, stripped of distractions, you are forced into a dialogue with the deepest parts of yourself. Every silence asks, what do you value? What do you desire? What do you fear? Most people never truly hear these questions, let alone answer them, because their lives are crowded with noise, partners, obligations, small talk, constant activity. The single person, however, stands before the mirror of existence with nowhere to hide. This confrontation can feel like despair, but despair is often the gateway to clarity. Aldous Huxley once suggested, "The more powerful and original a mind, the more it will incline towards the religion of solitude." What he calls religion here is not dogma, but devotion, the willingness to see solitude not as punishment but as practice. Like monks who retreat into cloisters, the single individual discovers a vast inner cathedral where silence is not emptiness but echo. But why does this matter? Because only those who can wrestle with the abyss can discover authentic freedom. If you are terrified of being alone, your relationships will always be contaminated by fear. You will cling, compromise, and collapse into the other, hoping they will protect you from yourself. But when you have made peace with solitude, you enter relationships, if you choose them, not as a beggar but as a sovereign. You can give love freely because you are not enslaved by the need to receive it. This is why Nietzsche spoke of solitude as both danger and necessity. He knew the abyss could destroy the weak but transform the strong. In Beyond Good and Evil, he warned, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Yet this gaze, if endured, reveals not just terror but possibility." The abyss is not merely darkness. It is the blank canvas upon which you may paint the meaning of your life. To stay single is to accept this canvas, to accept the terrifying freedom of authorship. You alone must write the story. No partner will write it for you. And from this authorship arises dignity, self-respect, and an unshakable sense of inner power. Now the question becomes, if solitude is a canvas, what shall we create upon it? What does the single life allow us to build that a life of dependence cannot? To answer this, we must turn to the idea of self-cultivation, the art of turning solitude into strength. Once the abyss has been faced, the solitary individual stands before a new horizon. Where others see emptiness, the single man or woman now perceives raw possibility. To remain unbound by romantic dependence is to be free to shape oneself without compromise. The question is no longer, who will complete me, but rather, what will I become? This is the forge of self-cultivation. Singleness is not merely the absence of a partner. It is the presence of untamed space, mental, emotional, temporal, in which the self can be forged. Time that others spend soothing or negotiating with a partner becomes time invested in creation, learning, discipline, and mastery. Energy that would be lost in conflict or compromise is instead funneled into building something extraordinary. Nietzsche revered this path of becoming. He called upon individuals to become their own experiments and urged them to treat life as a great work of art. To him, mediocrity was the inevitable result of conformity, and conformity was the inevitable result of living too much for others. The solitary individual, however, had the rare chance to resist this flattening, to pursue excellence without dilution. Think of the great creators, artists, thinkers, scientists, who often lived outside the ordinary bonds of marriage or at least depended on long stretches of solitude for their genius. Beethoven, unmarried, poured his passion into symphonies that continue to thunder across centuries. Emily Dickinson, reclusive and single, turned silence into poetry that still whispers with fire. Nikola Tesla, celibate by choice, declared, "I do not think you can name many great inventions that have been made by married men." Whether or not one agrees fully with Tesla's exaggeration, the principle remains clear. Solitude sharpens focus, and focus breeds greatness. Arthur Schopenhauer, though notorious for his cynicism about human relations, captured this truth in a single piercing remark. "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he is alone that he is really free." This freedom is not trivial. It is the freedom to live by your own rhythm, to cultivate your own talents, to think thoughts undisturbed by the demands of another's expectations. To stay single, then, is to create the conditions for a life of depth. Solitude is the soil in which discipline can take root, where creativity can blossom, and where true originality can emerge. It is a place of refinement. The single person has the luxury and the responsibility to design their days around their highest values rather than around compromise. Of course, this path is not without its trials. Freedom is intoxicating, but it is also dangerous. It demands that you confront procrastination, idleness, and the temptation of self-indulgence. Without the external structure of a partner or family, the single individual must become their own master. But this is not a weakness, it is precisely what strengthens the will. Self-mastery, like iron tempered by fire, is forged in solitude. The reward? A life lived not as echo but as voice. A life of cultivation rather than concession. In choosing singleness, you preserve the rare chance to turn yourself into someone remarkable. Someone who does not merely consume culture but creates it, who does not merely follow paths but blazes them. And yet, even as one rises in this solitary strength, another question emerges. What of love itself? Is the single person condemned to live without it, or can love be reimagined outside the confines of possession and dependency? It is here, in the redefinition of love, that the solitary path reaches its deepest power. If staying single is the cultivation of the self, does this mean love is to be discarded, avoided, or treated as dangerous? Not at all. To remain single is not to deny love, but to purify it, stripping away the chains of possession, need, and dependency that so often distort it. Most relationships collapse under the weight of expectation. You must complete me. You must cure my loneliness. You must make my life meaningful. These demands smother the very love they seek to protect, for they transform another human being into an object, a remedy, a means to an end. What masquerades as affection becomes subtle coercion. Sartre diagnosed this tension with brutal honesty. Hell is other people. He did not mean that others are inherently torment, but that we so often attempt to trap them within the prison of our gaze, forcing them to play roles that affirm our fragile sense of self. The single life, however, offers liberation from this game. In solitude, you learn to stand whole. You no longer need to chain another person to your existence in order to feel secure. And once that need dissolves, love, true love, becomes possible. For the first time, you can meet another human being as they are, not as an instrument of your comfort but as a free soul standing beside your own. Jean-Paul Sartre's partner, Simone de Beauvoir, captured this higher vision of love when she wrote, "I am incapable of conceiving infinity, and yet I do not accept finity. I want to die, but I do not accept death. I want love, but I do not accept its end." What she points to here is the eternal hunger of the human heart, our yearning for love without decay, without possession, without reduction. Paradoxically, it is the single individual unafraid of solitude who comes closest to realizing this vision. For the one who is whole alone loves not from desperation, but from abundance. They do not seek to drain the other, but to give freely, because their well is already full. They can cherish without clinging, admire without controlling, and part without collapsing. This is not the love of fairy tales. It is something rarer, more luminous, and more real. Nietzsche, again, hinted at this when he wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. Love, when tainted by dependency, becomes another form of tribal conformity, a contract of security rather than a dance of freedom. But love born of solitude transcends this. It becomes a meeting of equals, each strong in themselves, each unwilling to sacrifice the fire of their individuality for the lukewarm comfort of compromise. This vision terrifies society because it undermines the institution of love as control. If two people are together not because they must, but because they choose to again and again in freedom, the bond becomes ungovernable. Cannot be legislated, coerced, or reduced to tradition. It is revolutionary in its purity. And so, the single life does not end in lovelessness. Rather, it is the path to the only kind of love worthy of the name. Love as gift, not demand. Love as recognition, not absorption. Love as a flame that illuminates, not a cage that suffocates. Yet still one final question looms. If the single life is so rich in solitude, cultivation, and even higher forms of love, what is its ultimate reward? What kind of human being emerges at the end of this path? To answer, we must arrive at the summit. The vision of freedom, authenticity, and transcendence that singleness alone makes possible. At the end of this path, when solitude has been faced, when the abyss has been endured, when self has been cultivated and love reimagined, one truth stands radiant. To remain single is to claim the crown of freedom. It is not freedom in the shallow sense of endless options, but in the profound sense of authorship, the freedom to become who you are without apology, without compromise, without dilution. This is the reward of the single life. It is the discovery that your existence need not be justified through another. You are not a fragment searching for completion, but a whole being in motion, an unfinished symphony of your own making. Nietzsche urged us to live dangerously, to become creators of our own values, and to refuse the comfort of ready-made meanings. Singleness embodies this daring. It is the refusal to let tradition, family, or fear dictate the script of your life. Freedom here is inseparable from authenticity. To remain single is to resist the masks we wear to secure approval, to reject the roles we are told to play. Husband, wife, mother, father, half of a pair. Instead, you stand as an individual, undivided, transparent to yourself. Sartre described freedom as a burden, that we are condemned to be free, forever responsible for what we make of ourselves. Singleness confronts us with this condemnation in its purest form. No partner can be blamed for your failures. No relationship can absorb your unrealized potential. You bear it all, and in bearing it, you awaken dignity. But this freedom is not cold isolation. On the contrary, it opens into transcendence. For the individual who has mastered solitude is no longer chained to the small circle of their own needs. They become capable of genuine compassion, of creative generosity, of seeing others not as props but as fellow travelers. Viktor Frankl believed that meaning was often found not in self-indulgence but in service, dedicating oneself to causes, creations, or responsibilities larger than one's own comfort. The single individual, free from entanglements of need, can channel their strength outward in precisely this way. Carl Jung once observed, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This privilege is not handed to those who conform blindly, but to those who dare to walk the solitary road." The single person, if they embrace the journey fully, becomes not half of something, but the living embodiment of wholeness. They show that human life does not require completion through another, but can blaze with meaning in and of itself. This is why staying single may be the best thing you can do, not because relationships are inherently bad, but because most people enter them for the wrong reasons. Fear, dependency, conformity. To reject these illusions is to step into a higher form of existence, one marked by self-mastery, creativity, authentic love, and uncompromising freedom. Picture it. A man or woman walking alone, not hunched in despair but upright, eyes alight, carrying within them a fire no one else can extinguish. They may walk beside others at times. They may share affection, laughter, even passion, but always from a place of fullness, never from lack. Their solitude is not a cage, but a crown. Their singleness is not absence, but abundance. In the end, Nietzsche's challenge resounds, become who you are. To stay single is to accept that challenge fully, to embrace the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of shaping your life without excuses. And perhaps that is the highest form of love, not love received from another, but love for existence itself, lived bravely and authentically on one's own terms.